Hello everybody, this is Pierce. I'm here to give you a rundown of each of the individual HST systems in their own little independent videos so you can access them quickly if you're running a game or starting with new players. So we're going to start with the check system. Let's go ahead and jump right into it. All the mechanisms related to checks happen between page 109 and 114 of the book. That's 115 if you're on the PDF. Just add a page to the pages that I reference here. The primary mechanism is illustrated on page 109 itself, and then everything after that is just modifiers. So let's check out page 109. You've got your character sheet in front of you. You'll see that you've got 3 different stat blocks that have an exert and perceive in them. This is the primary mechanism for determining how difficulty works in the game. And then you've got your proficiency scores that are down at the bottom. These are additions that are added to dice rolls in order to see if you can hit your target number. Here's the mechanism in a nutshell. You're going to be rolling 2 dice and then adding your proficiency score to the result of those dice. And if you happen to hit a 12, you pass. Target number in HSD2 is always 12. The 2 dice are determined by the difficulty of the check. So every check that you take has difficulty score, 0 through 5, determined by the guide. And in most cases, unless the check is particularly difficult, like you want to punch through a vault door or something like that, the checks are going to be more in the 0 through 3 range. So it's not a huge span of difficulties. You'll be comparing that difficulty score to one of your exert scores. In most cases, if you're trying to do something, or one of your perceived scores if you're trying to notice something. So let's say I want to try to hack a computer. Hacking is a sabotage skill. It uses mind exert as its primary stat. So this is the score that I'll be referencing when I'm trying to figure out what dice I'm supposed to roll against what difficulty on the check. So if I tell the guide that I want to hack this computer, the guide's going to think for a second and go, okay, this computer is difficulty 2. Go ahead and roll mind exert plus sabotage at difficulty 2. I'll compare my mind exert score, we'll say it's 2 in this case, to the difficulty score, which is also 2. And if they are equal to each other, I roll 2d8 and add my proficiency score. My proficiency score in sabotage for this character, we're going to say it's a 2, so I'll roll 2d8 plus 2, and if I come up with a 12, I've passed the check. Lower, I fail the check. Above or equal, I pass the check. Let's say the difficulty was higher than my score, so the difficulty was 3 and I've got a 2. If my score is less than the difficulty of the task by 1, I roll d6 plus d8 and add my proficiency score. If it's less by 2, I roll d6 plus d6 and add my difficulty score. So it's basically decreasing by 1. Each dice is decreasing by 1 unit every time it goes down. And the opposite is true if I'm higher than the difficulty. So if the difficulty of the task is, say, a 1 and I'm a 2, I'm going to roll d6 plus d10 and add the proficiency score. If I'm better than it by 2 points, so if the task difficulty is 0 and I'm a 2 in my mind exert, I'll roll d10 plus d10, then d12 plus d10, then d12 plus d12, etc. as my stats go up or the difficulty goes down. In all circumstances, still trying to hit a 12. Once you get above by 5 steps, you actually get to add special unique modifiers to the roll, like describing what happens or getting cooler results and stuff like that. It doesn't go up into like d20s. It caps at d12s on the high end and d4s on the low end. So the lowest dice roll you're going to make in this game is d4 plus d4. On page 110, you can see a chart of different difficulty values. This is just for the guide to understand which ones are most applicable to what situations. In most cases, you're going to be staying here on the left side, difficulty 0 through 3. When things get crazy difficult, you'll go over here to a 4 through 6 range. On the page following that, we get into things like special properties and modifiers. Properties are unique traits that happen either when you're way above or way below the difficulty, like by 5 points, or if you have something called a boon or a fault in this particular task, which is something that comes out of character creation, just indicates that your character is particularly good or particularly bad at this task. It allows you to do things like perform the task silently, or get discounts on what you're doing, or do it in a way that is undetectable. It lets you flavor your check success. You can kind of think of it like having a critical failure or a great success in another system, only it isn't quite so random. The most common modifier to any check is this one down here on the bottom called dice modifiers, simplify and complicate. Simplifies and complicates come from things in character creation, they come from unique equipment, they come from abilities, they can even come from the environment. It's a keyword that describes increasing or decreasing the difficulty of the check by 1 point. So let's go back to that computer example. I've got a computer at difficulty 2 that I'm trying to hack, and I've got a 2 in my mind exert score and a 2 in sabotage. But the guide says, you know, the pressure is on right now, there are people trying to sneak up on me, they're going to attack me soon, and I need to do this in a hurry, so the check is complicated. That means that the difficulty goes from 2 to 3. So now I have to try to make this on a difficulty 3 check as opposed to a 2 because the environment has made it difficult for me. The opposite is true with simplifies. If we try to have the same situation and it turns out that I have a ability, maybe a surgery, that makes me particularly good at this task, I might simplify this check and the difficulty goes from 2 to 1. The mechanism here in the lower right of this page just refers to modifying checks using things like focus, which is the most common way that characters themselves will modify checks. Focus is an ability that everybody has when they buy into it at character creation. Readiness works off the same idea, and you can use focus points to add +1 to your rolls, or -1 if you really want to, or re-roll dice. And this mechanism here in the corner is described just when you can add +1s or -1s, the rules that are associated with +1s, like you can't add more than 3 +1s to any given check. Even if you've got 20 focus, you can only add +3 total to any given check. And re-rolls, dice that are a regular roll of 1 cannot be re-rolled. They can be +1 up to 2 and then re-rolled. Basically, it costs 2 focus to re-roll a 1. Or a die that has been re-rolled once cannot be re-rolled again. The last part of that section is the risky rule. Just means that if a check is actually labeled risky, it can't be modified. You can't re-roll it, you can't +1 it. It is dangerous, and you're only going to get the one shot at it. Opposed checks happen when you have 2 people trying to compete against a common goal. And it's not actually combat. Combat has its own set of rules. But opposed checks is pitting skills against each other that are basically the same skill. In an opposed check, you'll both be rolling the same exert score and the same proficiency. So if you're trying to do like an arm wrestling contest or something like that, you'll both be rolling body exert plus athletics. The difficulty score for the check is found by comparing the 2 exert scores. So if I have a body exert of 2 and they have a body exert of 3, then my difficulty is 3, their difficulty is 2. You roll the dice like normal, and you need to do 2 things. You need to hit a 12 to even compete. If you didn't hit a 12, your hand slipped, right? You just failed the check. And in the event that we both hit 12s, which is fairly likely, the person who has the highest roll ends up winning that check. Perception checks. Perception checks are a little bit different. They work off the same mechanism. You're going to be rolling 2 dice, and you're going to be adding something to them in order to try to get a 12. But perception doesn't actually have a proficiency score to it. What happens instead is you have the skill of perceiving, which is represented by your perception score in mind, body, or community. And then you just have your general kind of wherewithal, which is represented by your exert score and those same stats. So when you're rolling perception, you're going to be comparing the difficulty score to your perceive score instead of your exert score. So if I have a mind perceive of 2 and the difficulty to perceive this is a 2, then those are the 2 things that I'm comparing. And instead of adding my proficiency score to them, like athletics or sabotage or what have you, I'm going to be adding my mind exert score to it. So it's a more generic skill check, mostly because when you're trying to perceive things, you're generally pulling on everything at once. Your exert score is what's being added to the check, and your perception stat is what's being used to determine the difficulty comparison. So an example of that would be, and this is the most common one, is just trying to spot something in the room. So that the guide says make a body perceive check at difficulty 3. Something is fairly well hidden. We're supposed to see it. So I've got a body perceive score of say 2. So I'm 1 below the difficulty. So I'm going to be rolling at D6 plus D8, right? Because I'm 1 below the common difficulty of D8 plus D8, and I'm going to be adding my body exert score to this die roll. I roll the dice, and I get an 11. Not quite there. I could use a focus point, if I've got a focus point, to bump this up to 12, and then I would pass. Saves. Saves are unique in that they are a way for you to avoid an environmental issue or try to survive an environmental issue. So they're usually against a stagnant threat or something that is ongoing, like cold or heat or something like that. Dodges are used when the boulder is coming down the mountain sort of thing, or you just stepped in a trap. Not typically used for dodging things like bullets. We just kind of assume that you're not faster than the bullet. So the general combat evasion is used for that. But most things that involve a dodge save will have it written on the item, or it's just something that happens in the environment. A door is going to slam in your face kind of thing. You need to get out of the way. Saves roll just like checks. Each of the saves has a unique stat that they work off of. So dodge saves use body perceive in order to determine difficulty comparison. Endure saves use body exert in order to determine difficulty comparison. And resolve saves use the weaker of your 2 mind scores, so either exert or perceive, whichever one is weaker, in order to figure out where the difficulty compares to. So if I'm trying to dodge against a rock that's coming down in the area, my body perceived score is a 2, and the rock coming down is also a 2, then I'm again at D8 plus D8. The thing that is added to them is your dodge save, or your endure save, or your resolve save. Those are determined during character creation and buffed in various ways. They typically are fairly low numbers, so if you can find additional ways to buff them, it's often very valuable, because these saves don't get used often, but they tend to hurt when you fail them, so it's a nice thing to kind of look out for. And that's it. That's all the mechanisms that are in the check section. That's basically everything you need in order to run the game before you get into combat, which has its own little system, which honestly is a whole lot like the check system. It just has an extra step in it for accuracy. From here, the only other part of this section in the book is referring to things like community persuasion, which is just kind of explaining how it works in story. It's not really a different mechanism. And rescues, which are a handy little feature, but don't really have anything to do with checks. All right, we'll see you next time.